Hello and welcome to Byjus Exam Prep. Welcome to our daily Hindu analysis. Before we begin, we have a couple of important announcements. First of all, let me wish you a very happy Diwali. And on the account of the festival, tomorrow would be a holiday, and as a result, there won't be daily videos such as the Hindu analysis, the daily quiz, and the big news. On Tuesday as well, we won't be able to bring out the Hindu analysis as the Hindu won't publish on Tuesday on the account of the festival. But however, we shall have the daily quiz and the big news. And tomorrow at 8 p.m., we shall also have Economy This Week. So don't forget to tune into these sessions and also catch the big news every day at 2 p.m. And for more such updates on important current affairs developments, do subscribe to our Telegram channel. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 14 of the Delhi edition. This column deals with the Financial Action Task Force or the FATF and its recent decision to remove Pakistan from its grey list. Since this is a very important topic for both international relations and internal security, let's examine this in detail by first talking about the history of FATF and its roles and functions. See, the FATF was constituted by the G7 countries back in 1989, primarily to counter money laundering. The Secretariat of FATF is located at the headquarters of OECD in Paris. And according to information available on its website, there are 37 countries who are members of FATF, along with 2 regional organizations, which includes the European Commission, which is the executive organ of the European Union, and as well as the Gulf Cooperation Council. So in total, FATF is made up of 39 members. And India became a part of this intergovernmental body in 2006 as an observer, and later in 2010, it has become a full-time member of the FATF. In the year 2001, following the 9/11 attacks, FATF's mandate was expanded to counter terror financing as well, because the 9/11 attacks clearly established the links between money laundering and terror financing. So it clearly emerged that money laundering was not just an economic threat, but was also a major security threat. And since then, FATF has been performing the role of combating money laundering and as well as terror financing. It essentially functions as a policy-making body that brings about a legal and regulatory framework which is mandated to be implemented by countries around the world through their national legislation. So essentially, FATF comes out with a set of regulatory standards to enforce anti-money laundering measures and counter-terror financing measures. And these recommendations of FATF have to be inculcated by all the countries through national laws. They are also expected to enforce these laws and report to the FATF on its implementation in order to ensure that countries are in compliance of FATF standards. As part of this mandate, FATF collaborates with a number of international organizations as well, including the UN Security Council. Apart from this, the FATF has 3 primary functions, which includes monitoring members' progress in implementing anti-money laundering measures, reviewing and reporting on laundering trends, techniques, and countermeasures, and promoting the adoption and implementation of FATF anti-money laundering standards around the world. So this intergovernmental body meets regularly, and the member countries have the powers to review the performance of other countries and jurisdictions during periodic reviews, plenary sessions, and while evaluating the mutual evaluation reports that are submitted by the countries. Through these powers, FATF members can review money laundering and terror financing techniques and countermeasures, and they can promote the adoption of these regulatory standards that are recommended by the FATF. So accordingly, FATF members are obligated to implement these standards along with other related international conventions adopted by international organizations like the UN. And through a national law, they are mandated to criminalize money laundering and to empower the authorities to confiscate the proceeds of money laundering and to attach the proceeds to the ongoing case. Members are also expected to provide for due customer diligence by the banking and financial system in their country and ensure that thorough identity verification and KYC norms are implemented in order to know the customer and to maintain bank records and financial statements as per FATF standards, and they're expected to report any suspicious transactions to the Financial Intelligence Unit, which has to be set up in every country. Along with a dedicated intelligence agency, members are also expected to set up a dedicated enforcement agency known as the Enforcement Directorate, which can enforce the laws against money laundering. Members are also expected to cooperate internationally and to help other countries in investigating and prosecuting cases of money laundering and terror financing. So members of FATF and as well as other jurisdictions, they are mandated to provide for a verifiable and transparent mechanism to review and check whether these countries are implementing the FATF standards, as money laundering and terror financing have emerged as serious security concerns. During the periodic review process, FATF can review the performance of the countries, and those who don't comply with the FATF standards will face consequences. Those countries and jurisdictions which are seen to be lacking in implementing the standards, they are initially put on notice by FATF by placing them on the grey list. Once a country is on the grey list, it is prescribed an action plan by FATF, which these countries are expected to implement within a given deadline. And if they fail to do that, and if they repeatedly fail to cooperate with FATF, then finally FATF can declare those countries as non-cooperative jurisdictions and place them on its blacklist. So if a country gets grey listed or blacklisted by the FATF, the economic consequences are quite severe, as grey listed countries come under enhanced monitoring of FATF and blacklisted countries face severe economic sanctions that will end up imposing a huge economic cost on that country. If a country is blacklisted by the FATF after failing to meet the standards, then it will invite economic sanctions from global lending institutions such as the IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, etc. And it will become impossible to get loans from these institutions, and will also lead to a boycott against the country from international trade, thereby affecting its exports and also its ability to import key raw materials, and has serious implications for inflow of capital into the country as well. Credit rating agencies will downgrade the sovereign rating of such countries to junk status, thereby affecting the flow of investments and FDI into the country. So India's neighbor Pakistan, which has become a state sponsor of terrorism, has been the target of FATF on several occasions, as Pakistan has repeatedly failed to meet the FATF norms and standards. Pakistan was placed on FATF's grey list between 2012 and 2015 following the Mumbai attacks of 26/11, as India and Western countries had put tremendous pressure on Pakistan by using the FATF as a platform to push Pakistan to act against terror financing and money laundering. In fact, Pakistan was first placed on the grey list in 2008 itself, immediately after the Mumbai attacks, but this was just for a short period. After Pakistan showed some compliance, it had been taken off the grey list in 2009. But later, since Pakistan failed to show any improvement, India and US in particular used FATF to target Pakistan and was placed on the grey list again in 2012. So Pakistan continued to remain on the grey list until 2015, and after showing some progress, it was again taken off the list. But Pakistan's repeated failure in matching FATF standards and in enforcing the counter money laundering and anti-terror financing measures led Pakistan to be placed on the grey list again in 2018 and continue to remain on the list until October 2022. The problem with Pakistan has been that it hasn't complied with UN Resolution 2462 that mandates every UN member to criminalize terror financing and abide by UN sanctions, particularly the sanctions imposed by 1267 Sanctions Committee against globally designated terrorists and terror outfits. But Pakistan had repeatedly failed to act against terrorism and terror financing, and even when it arrested top terrorists like Masood Azhar and Hafiz Saeed, they were charged under criminal laws and not under anti-terror laws. And Pakistan had failed to freeze their financial assets and accounts and it had failed to deny them weapon access and place a travel ban on them. In fact, several top wanted terrorists belonging to Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Al-Qaeda and others, they would freely roam around in Pakistan, attend public rallies, and even raise donations for terrorism and terror recruitment against India, while Pakistan would turn a blind eye to these acts of terrorism and terror financing. So it was because of this failure of Pakistan to tackle money laundering and terror financing that it was placed on the grey list for the third time in 2018. And it had been given an action plan by FATF consisting of 34 targets which Pakistan was supposed to implement. Finally, after 5 years of effort, Pakistan has managed to implement some of these measures against money laundering and terror financing, and as a result, during the recent plenary session that was held just a couple of days back, FATF has agreed to remove Pakistan from the grey list as it finally showed some improvement. India, which is also a member of FATF, has backed the decision to remove Pakistan from the grey list along with Nicaragua. But countries such as DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Mozambique and Tanzania have been added to the grey list, and Myanmar has been elevated from the grey list to the black list following the military coup carried out by Myanmar's military, following which there has been a serious deterioration in law and order and human rights and fundamental rights in the country. Myanmar has been accused of not acting against money laundering and terror financing, and Myanmar has been elevated from the grey list to the black list, which places Myanmar in the same group as that of Iran and North Korea, which currently are the only countries which have been blacklisted by the FATF. So in this context, it's very important to analyze why Pakistan was retained on the grey list for 5 years. Pakistan was failing to implement the standards recommended by the United Nations under Resolutions 2462 and 1267. Pakistan had failed to criminalize terror financing as per UN Resolution 2462, and it had failed to impose the sanctions under 1267 Sanctions Committee. Globally designated terrorists by the 1267 Sanctions Committee of the UNSC, they are supposed to be brought under financial sanctions where all their financial assets will be frozen, along with an embargo on their travel and their ability to access arms and weapons. But Pakistan's repeated failure in this regard, and the fact that top terrorists such as Masood Azhar, Hafiz Saeed, and Zakir Rahman Lakwi would freely roam around in the country and organize terror attacks, led to the continued actions of FATF against Pakistan. But finally, Pakistan seems to have made progress in implementing the 34 targets given under the action plan. And India, which is also a member of FATF, has agreed to the FATF decision, and finally Pakistan has been taken off the grey list. So now, India expects Pakistan to strictly abide by these standards and continue taking credible, verifiable and irreversible sustained measures against money laundering and terror financing. Going forward, India is likely to use the FATF platform and the mutual evaluation reports to ensure that Pakistan doesn't contribute to the spread and proliferation of WMDs or weapons of mass destruction. This became clear earlier this year when India's foreign minister told the Indian Parliament while introducing the WMD Prohibition of Unlawful Activities Amendment Act that India will be using international platforms like FATF and UNSC to continue to put pressure on Pakistan in order to prevent the proliferation of WMDs. So early next year, India is all set to lead the FATF to review mutual evaluation reports of other countries, and India is likely to use the platform to continue putting pressure on Pakistan, both with regard to terror financing and as well as with regard to proliferation of WMDs. Now let's take up another column from page number 14, which helps us understand Basel III norms, along with the role of the RBI in monitoring the financial stability of a bank. See, this topic is in news because recently the Kerala-based Dhanlakshmi Bank has been under a controversy as its minority shareholders have alleged that the bank's management has misused the funds of the bank, which has led to unnecessary operational cost and has eroded the bank's capital. And they have also blamed the bank's management for not being transparent with regard to the disclosure of accounts and statements. And they even approached the RBI complaining about the general mismanagement of business by the Dhanlakshmi Bank. So, following these serious allegations, the Reserve Bank of India has stepped in and placed the Dhanlakshmi Bank under tight monitoring in order to keep a check on its financial stability and health in line with the Basel III norms. See, these measures being initiated by the RBI against the bank is in line with the Basel norms. The Basel norms refers to a set of global banking standards to regulate the functioning of banks which are enforced by central banks like RBI. Basel is a city in Switzerland where the Bureau of International Settlements is headquartered. This institution fosters cooperation among central banks, and they have a common goal of ensuring financial stability and to enforce common standards with regard to banking regulations. So, to ensure the stability of the global banking and financial system, the Bureau of International Settlement had constituted the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which has brought out the Basel norms, which are obligatory on the central banks to implement and enforce within their jurisdiction, and also empowers the central banks to keep a check on the financial situation of the banking system and also to monitor the functioning and performance of the banks. In 1988, Basel I norms were introduced with regard to maintenance of capital adequacy, which is basically the minimum capital requirement to ensure that the banks are functioning in a healthy situation. Through this, a minimum capital requirement was introduced, which was enhanced further over the years when Basel II norms were brought out in 2004 and they were enforced from 2006 onwards. Then, following the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, Basel III norms were adopted to ensure the financial stability of the banking system, which has been implemented from 2015 onwards. India currently is implementing the Basel III norms, and around the world by 2023, Basel III norms are supposed to be enforced strictly. Going forward, Basel IV norms will also be enforced, which was adopted in 2017. And all these norms essentially seek to stabilize the banking system by giving extraordinary powers to the central banks so that they can strictly monitor the financial health of the banking system and even take adequate measures to protect the banks which are not in a healthy situation and even to hold the board accountable for their mismanagement. Under Basel III norms, three key pillars have been identified, which includes enhanced minimum capital and liquidity requirements, as a result of which banks are supposed to maintain their capital to risk weighted assets ratio or CRAR at 9% or above. Then pillar 2 of Basel III norms provides for enhanced supervisory and review process, which gives more powers to the central bank, and pillar 3 allows the central banks to enforce enhanced risk disclosure and market discipline on the banks. So this is where you need to understand the concept of capital adequacy ratio, which was introduced through the Basel norms. Capital adequacy ratio is essentially an indicator of the ability of a bank to survive as a going business entity or as a functional business entity in case it suffers significant losses on its account book, especially the credit book. Essentially, this ratio provides an indication about the asset liability health of a bank, because if a bank's total assets, if it were to drop below its liabilities, it would essentially wipe out its capital or net worth, thereby making the bank insolvent or essentially making it bankrupt. So the regulations laid out under Basel III norms empower central banks to closely monitor these changes in the capital adequacy ratio of banks so that central banks can step in and prevent major bank failures, which can have a cascading effect on the entire banking system. Now, please understand that when we say the capital position of a bank, it does not just mean the cash that is held by the bank. The liquid cash held by the bank is, of course, essential to meet the demand made by the depositors on time. But CRAR, capital to risk weighted assets ratio, is a much more comprehensive indicator, as it compares the value of a bank's capital or net worth against the value of its various assets weighted according to how risky each asset is. So, from a bank's perspective, the loans that it has given out act as assets as it fetches revenue to the bank, but the risk associated with loans depends on the borrower and also on the financial situation. This risk factor will not be constant, it keeps varying with time and with the financial situation, and hence these risks are computed with regard to the assets of the bank, and this in comparison with its liability gives us an estimate of the bank's capital adequacy ratio. This is the minimum adequacy ratio a bank has to maintain in order to continue serving its demands. That is essentially the liabilities of the bank, which is nothing but the deposits held by the depositors, as the risk associated with the assets keeps fluctuating. So during times of financial crisis, the capital adequacy ratio will of course see a fluctuation because the assets of the bank tend to become risky and they might become non-performing assets, which will affect the health and the financial situation of the bank itself. So according to Basel III norms, banks are required to maintain a minimum CRAR of 9%. And in the case of India, RBI has enforced the CRAR at 9% or above. And in case of any risk to capital adequacy, the RBI will immediately step in to take emergency measures to restore the health of the bank in order to prevent the complete failure of the bank itself. So in the recent case of the Dhanlakshmi Bank and the crisis the bank is facing, RBI has invoked its extraordinary powers to monitor the situation of the bank as per the Basel III norms, and RBI is keeping a close watch on the capital adequacy ratio of the Dhanlakshmi Bank. Along with this, the RBI has stipulated various measures to be taken by the bank under a prompt corrective action framework in order to strengthen the financial position of the bank. And under the prompt corrective action framework, RBI even has the powers to restrict the lending activity of the bank in order to strengthen its financial situation and even place curbs on its expenditure and operational costs so that the financial position of the bank can improve. In a worst case scenario, the RBI can step in and remove the management and the board and can completely take over the functioning of the bank as well. Next, on the front page of the Delhi edition, the Hindu covers an important development in international relations. According to the article, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, also popularly referred to as MBS, is expected to make an historic visit to India next month. This will provide an opportunity for Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to interact with MBS and take forward the strategic relations between India and Saudi Arabia. The two leaders are expected to discuss key issues, including the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict and the impact of Western economic sanctions against Russia. They're also likely to talk about the recent decisions of OPEC Plus to cut oil production, which affects oil prices, thereby affecting India's interests. And as Saudi Arabia is a key oil supplier to India, these issues are going to dominate the discussion between the two leaders. Following this interaction between the leaders of India and Saudi Arabia, both the leaders are expected to travel to Indonesia to attend the G20 summit. But as a result of this busy engagement, PM Modi is likely to miss attending this year's ASEAN Summit and East Asia Summit. So in this context, let's understand a little more about India-Saudi relations and also talk about India's ties with ASEAN and East Asia Summit. See, Saudi Arabia is a key Sunni power in West Asia, and India happens to share very important strategic relations with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has consistently been a top oil supplier to India, and in most years, it is the second top supplier of energy to India. So clearly, Saudi Arabia plays an important role with regard to India's energy security, and the two countries have established a strategic partnership when they signed the Riyadh Declaration in 2010. So due to India's dependency on Saudi Arabia for oil supplies, Saudi Arabia is a key partner for India. And along with this, there is a strong Indian diaspora community in Saudi Arabia, as more than 4 million Indians reside and work in the country, thus representing a key aspect of the relationship. The Indian diaspora not only establish close cultural ties between the two countries, but they also contribute immensely to the economy of Saudi Arabia, especially in key sectors like oil, construction, hospitality, etc. The Indian diaspora also contribute immensely to the Indian economy as they send back precious remittances back home to their families in India, which helps in improving India's forex position and is critical for bridging our current account deficit. We also share very close historical and cultural ties because Saudi Arabia is home to key religious centers like Mecca and Medina, where lakhs of Indians visit every year as part of the Hajj pilgrimage. Today, this relationship has truly transformed, especially over the last 12 years, as Saudi Arabia has started balancing India with Pakistan. Because prior to signing of Riyadh Declaration, Saudi Arabia was seen to be largely inclined towards Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia would never criticize Pakistan for sponsoring terrorism against India. Saudi Arabia was also not cooperating with India in counterterrorism. But following the signing of Riyadh Declaration, during the visit of then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, India-Saudi Arabia cemented a strong security and strategic partnership, and since then, Saudi Arabia has played a key role in helping India in counterterrorism and in tackling the threats posed by various terror groups such as Lashkar-e-Toiba, Indian Mujahideen and others, which have been directly backed by Pakistan. Even on sensitive issues such as the Kashmir conflict and Pakistan's preference to bring up these issues at global bodies such as Organization of Islamic Cooperation, even on such sensitive issues and such global platforms, Saudi Arabia has started taking a more neutral position and has often abstained from these votes which are pushed by Pakistan against India. So this clearly represents a strategic shift in Saudi Arabia's relations with India, which has been followed by other key powers of the region such as United Arab Emirates as well. Apart from this, Saudi Arabia has become a major investor in India in the oil sector and as well as in the infrastructure sector, thus leading to strong economic relations as well between the two countries. So the two leaders are going to meet next month to take forward this relationship and also to address some of the concerns in the bilateral ties. But as a result of this visit, Prime Minister Modi may have to skip participating at the ASEAN Summit and East Asia Summit, which is also equally important for India. India initiated the Look East policy back in 1991, following the end of the Cold War and following India's economic crisis, to seek out new partners who could back and support India. So since 1991, India has built very close relations with Southeast Asian countries and as well as with East Asian countries through its Look East policy, which has been recently upgraded to the Act East policy in 2014. The foundation of the Look East Act East policy is based on India's relations with a very important regional grouping of Southeast Asia, that is the ASEAN. ASEAN brings together 10 key Southeast Asian countries, including Myanmar, Cambodia, Singapore, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Brunei, and Philippines. India not only shares good bilateral relations with almost all these countries, but we have also established very close relations with the ASEAN group itself since 1992. India was even given the status of a dialogue partner, and with the help of ASEAN, we even became a member of a larger group called the ASEAN Regional Forum. So 2022 marks the 30th anniversary of this important relationship. And over the last 30 years, we have not only built close political relations, but we've also built very close economic relations by signing a free trade agreement with ASEAN that covers goods, services, and investments. And especially under Act East policy, India has been stepping up defense and military relations, along with focus on cultural relations and connectivity. So considering the importance of this relationship, it is quite significant that PM Modi is likely to miss the India-ASEAN Summit, as India is expected to be given the status of a comprehensive strategic partner by the ASEAN group, which has already extended this status to other key ASEAN partners such as China, Japan, Australia, and the others. This will also affect India's participation at the East Asia Summit, which is a leading forum for the Indo-Pacific region to promote cooperation between key powers of the Indo-Pacific. The East Asia Summit was established in 2005 as a strategic dialogue between the leaders of important countries of the Indo-Pacific. It has 18 members that includes not just the 10 ASEAN countries, but also covers major powers of Indo-Pacific such as Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, Russia, and the United States. This grouping is led by the ASEAN countries and represents around 53% of the global population and nearly 60% of the global GDP. India has been a very active participant at the East Asia Summit as the grouping focuses on 6 priority areas that covers environment and ecology, education, finance, global health issues and pandemic diseases, disaster management and ASEAN connectivity. Now let's take a look at an article from page number 9 that refers to Rohingya refugees in India. According to the article, the Ministry of Home Affairs has announced that information related to Rohingya detention centers in the country is a secret classified information. So in this context, let's briefly understand who are the Rohingyas and what is India's position with regard to Rohingyas. See, the Rohingyas are an ethnic Muslim minority that historically belonged to the Chittagong Cox's Bazar area of today's Bangladesh. But centuries ago, Rohingyas had naturally migrated and they had settled in the neighboring Rakhine region of the then Arakan kingdom. But after the colonial period ended, new boundaries came up as new countries were born, including India, Myanmar, Pakistan, that is essentially East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh. So in modern times, Rohingyas had become settled in the Rakhine state of Myanmar, but Myanmar's army, which captured power in the country in 1962, started aligning with radical Buddhists, and they would begin a deliberate policy of discrimination and oppression against Rohingyas. And through citizenship laws, they took away the citizenship of Rohingyas and declared them stateless. And later, Myanmar even took a stand that Rohingyas are the responsibility of Bangladesh as they historically belong to Chittagong and Cox's Bazar and they don't belong to Rakhine region. So this oppressive discriminatory policy of Myanmar, led by its government and army and radical Buddhists, has even led to targeted violence against Rohingyas. And as a result, it has pushed Rohingyas out who have sought refuge in nearby countries in order to save their lives. Over the years, there have been many riots between Rohingyas and radical Buddhists, and even Myanmar's army has unleashed violence against Rohingyas in the name of counter-terrorism, thereby triggering a large humanitarian crisis. And especially between 2012 and 2017, multiple riots and clashes happened, which triggered a major refugee crisis, which has had a huge impact on Bangladesh and as well as on India. This enormous suffering faced by Rohingyas had led the United Nations and even global NGOs such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to label the Rohingyas as the world's most persecuted community. So Bangladesh has received a huge refugee inflow over the years, and over the decades around 40,000 Rohingyas have entered India as well, who are settled in different parts of the country, including the northeast of India, in and around Delhi, and they can also be found in parts of Jammu and Kashmir, Hyderabad, and as well as parts of Uttar Pradesh. Generally, India hadn't been hostile to Rohingya refugees, given their position, and since India has a rich history of accepting refugees to protect human rights, India had passively allowed the Rohingyas to settle without taking a hostile aggressive position against them. But in the last few years, the Indian government has labeled Rohingyas as a security threat and has taken a hostile position against them, since a few extremist Rohingyas have set up a terrorist outfit called ARSA, or the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, which is waging war in Myanmar against the army and radical Buddhists. India perceives the ARSA to be a threat given its close links with Lashkar-e-Toiba, Al-Qaeda and Pakistan's ISI, and as a result, it has led India to take a stand against Rohingya refugees as a whole. This has often led to criticism against India's position from the UN and as well as from the Supreme Court of India and the National Human Rights Commission. But India insists that India is not obligated under the Refugee Convention of 1951, as India is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention and the 1967 additional protocol to it. Recently, India had even stated that it will identify the existing Rohingyas and it will start deporting them back to Myanmar. But however, this has triggered a controversy because any such move by India to forcefully deport Rohingyas back to Myanmar, where they still face the risk of violence, could lead India to violate the UN Principle on Non-Refoulement. According to the UN Principle on Non-Refoulement, no country can force refugees to go back to a place where they will face targeted violence. And thus, India's position against Rohingyas has led to a controversy in the recent years. According to India's domestic laws, such refugees who are yet to be deported are supposed to be lodged in detention centers, and the Home Ministry has refused to provide any information on Rohingya detention centers in India by labeling this as secret classified information. Now let's look at an article from page number 10. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has launched Rozgar Mela or recruitment drive to fill thousands of vacancies in various government ministries and departments, as was promised by the Prime Minister and the government during this year's Union Budget. Earlier this year, the Prime Minister had committed to create around 10 lakh job opportunities in the Union government, to create adequate livelihood opportunities, and to support the unemployed youth in the country. While launching this scheme, the Prime Minister has pointed out that the key decisions taken by the government in the past 8 years have strengthened India's economy, and they helped India to tide over the economic crisis created by the pandemic. Now, coming to the last part of today's discussion, we have an important update on page number 9 with regard to China. Over the last several weeks, we have repeatedly spoken about the importance of the National Congress or the Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, which was held recently in China. This Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party has concluded, and as we had discussed, Xi Jinping is all set to begin his third term as the President of China by virtue of being the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. So while cementing his position within the Communist Party, Xi Jinping has ensured that his key rivals and opponents have been forced out of the party, and the supreme authoritarian position of Xi Jinping was confirmed during the Party Congress because China's constitution has again been amended, which now mandates the party members to respect and abide by the core status of Xi Jinping as the topmost leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Earlier, China's constitution had been amended to pave the way for Xi Jinping to occupy a third term as a Chinese president, because previously a convention prevented Xi Jinping from seeking presidentship beyond the 2 terms. This convention laid down during the period of Deng Xiaoping was done away with this amendment, and now another amendment has been introduced in the Chinese constitution that mandates every Communist Party member and the delegates to give utmost respect to the core status of Xi Jinping within the party and follow the path and guidelines laid down by the leadership core which has been chosen by Xi Jinping. This clearly establishes China as an increasingly authoritarian state and will obviously have implications for India as a result of the standing border dispute that we have with China. Now let's take a look at a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: FATF plays a pivotal role in tackling money laundering and terror financing. In the light of the statement, examine the functions of FATF and its recent actions against Pakistan. The second question: what do you understand by capital adequacy ratio? In the context of Basel III norms, discuss how RBI monitors the financial stability of a bank. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link has been provided in the description box below. So with this, I would like to conclude my discussion for today. And if you like the session, do support us by pressing the like button, share the video with other aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.